By the time the gavel fell a second time on the Bracken tract, the land wasn't measured in acres anymore, but in millions of dollars. The silence in the auction hall that day was thick enough to stand a hammer in, a heavy, breathless thing made of shock and envy. But that all came later, after the lawyers and the geologists, after the headlines and the quiet vindication. It began, as most things of true worth do, in a place of public disregard, on a cold Tuesday morning in the basement of the Oakley County Courthouse, where a piece of land and an old man were both about to be sold for nothing. When Elias Thorne shuffled in that morning, clutching a dented Stanley thermos and a worn leather satchel, the only thing he was worth to the room was a quiet, dismissive laugh. The room itself was a monument to civic indifference. It smelled of damp wool coats, stale coffee, and the slow, papery decay of forgotten files. The walls were painted a shade of institutional beige that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the fluorescent tubes overhead hummed a weary, electric dirge. A dozen or so men were scattered amongst the rows of uncomfortable wooden chairs, a familiar flock of local predators. There were the Vance brothers, beefy and red-faced, who bought up foreclosed farms to strip them of timber and topsoil. There was a thin, weaselly man named Peterson, who specialized in tax liens, strangling homeowners with penalties and fees. And at the front, holding court near the auctioneer's podium, was Marcus Sterling. Sterling was the future, or at least he had convinced the county commissioners he was. He wore a suit the color of a thundercloud, and shoes so polished they reflected the tired lights above like pools of black oil. He wasn't from Oakley County. He had arrived 2 years prior with a briefcase full of architectural renderings and a voice as smooth and persuasive as flowing money. He spoke of progress and property values, of turning the county's sleepy rolling hills into a destination, a community of luxury homes he had already named Sterling Estates. His smile was a practiced, perfect thing, but it never reached his eyes, which were constantly scanning, assessing, calculating. He was a man who understood the price of everything and the value of absolutely nothing. Into this arena of quiet, methodical avarice, Elias Thorne was an anomaly. He was 78 years old, his frame stooped from a lifetime of leaning over engines and fences. His flannel shirt was clean but frayed at the cuffs, and his work boots, though sturdy, were scuffed and stained with the grease and earth of a life spent in service to tangible things. His face was a roadmap of seasons, etched with the fine lines of sun and worry, but his eyes, a pale and startling blue, held a clarity that belied his age. They were the eyes of a man who knew how to wait, who had learned the profound difference between looking and seeing. He didn't take a seat in the main rows. Instead, he moved to the side of the room, near a large cork-backed board where the day's properties were listed on tacked-up sheets of paper. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step placed with an economy of motion that spoke of conserved energy. The other men in the room registered his presence with a flicker of annoyance or amusement. They knew Elias. He was the old man who ran a small engine repair shop out of his barn, a relic from a bygone era who still believed a handshake was a contract, and who would spend an entire day machining a single obsolete part rather than tell a customer their old tractor was finished. To them, he was a piece of local folklore, harmless and irrelevant. Elias ignored them. His attention was fixed on the board. He ran a gnarled finger down the list, past the small residential lots and the foreclosed commercial buildings, until it stopped at the bottom. Lot 34. The Bracken Tract. The description was stark, almost a warning. 320 acres, unimproved land, no road access, sold as is. Next to it in parentheses was the reason for the sale. Unpaid tax line, 1958, amount due, $86.42. $86.42. It was a joke. A sum so small for a parcel so large, it could only mean the land was profoundly and irrevocably worthless. It was a swamp, or a sheer rock face, or an environmental wasteland. It was landlocked, an island of dirt in a sea of private property, inaccessible and therefore useless. It had been on the county's books for decades, a clerical ghost that no one could figure out how to exorcise. The sale was a formality. a final attempt to clear the ledger before writing it off completely. A low chuckle broke the room's quiet murmur. It was Marcus Sterling. He had moved away from the podium and was standing a few feet behind Elias, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. "Still chasing ghosts, old man?" Sterling's voice was pitched just loud enough for the others to hear, a performance of casual dominance. "My grandfather used to tell me about this piece. The Bracken Folly, he called it." Elias didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the paper. Sterling took a step closer, his tone dripping with condescending pity. "Some things are forgotten for a reason, Elias. It's a dead parcel. No access, no water, no value. It's just a hole in the map. You ought to let the dead land lie." A few of the other developers snickered in agreement. The phrase hung in the air, "Let the dead land lie." It was a dismissal not just of the property, but of Elias himself, a man they saw as clinging to a dead past, to dead machines and dead ways of thinking. Elias finally turned, his pale blue eyes meeting Sterling's for a brief, unreadable moment. He offered no argument, no defense. He simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if considering the advice. Then he turned back to the map, took a small folded notebook and a pencil stub from his satchel, and made a single, careful note. To Sterling, the silence was surrender. It was the meek deference of an old man who knew he was out of his depth. He smirked, took a sip of his coffee, and turned back to his conversation, the matter of Elias Thorne and the Bracken tract already forgotten. He had no way of knowing that he had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. He had mistaken restraint for weakness, he had mistaken silence for ignorance, and he had no idea that inside Elias Thorne's worn leather satchel, nestled beside the thermos in the notebook, was a key. Not a key of metal, but of paper and memory. A key that had been forged in a dusty barn 40 years earlier. A key that would unlock not only the dead land, but the carefully constructed future Marcus Sterling was so certain he owned. The auction was about to begin, but for Elias, the work had started a lifetime ago. The real beginning was in the smell of oil and hot metal, in the low, cathedral-like light of a barn on a summer afternoon. It was in the feel of a cold wrench in a young boy's hand, and the patient, rumbling voice of his mentor, Silas Blackwood. Silas wasn't his father, not by blood. Elias's own father had been a quiet man, lost to a weak heart when Elias was just a boy. Silas had been his neighbor, a farmer and a self-taught mechanic who had taken the grieving, aimless child under his wing. Silas was a man built of earth and iron. His hands were immense, the knuckles swollen and scarred, but they could diagnose the ailment of a sick engine with a touch as gentle as a doctor's. He moved with a purpose that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. He believed the world was a machine, a complex and interconnected system of gears and levers, and that if you were patient enough, you could understand how it all worked. His religion was precision. His scripture was the technical manual. "Everything tells a story," Silas would say, his voice a low, gravelly hum as he pointed to a smear of grease on a gasket. "This here isn't just dirt, son. This is a message. It's telling you a seal is failing. It's telling you where the pressure is, where the weakness is. Most folks just wipe it off. A good mechanic, he reads it first." The barn was their sanctuary. It was a library of salvaged parts and accumulated wisdom. The walls were lined with shelves holding coffee cans full of bolts and cotter pins, each one meticulously labeled in Silas's blocky handwriting. Old engine blocks sat on stands like ancient sculpture, their inner workings exposed. And against the far wall, away from the grease and the grime, was Silas's most prized possession, the binders. There were 24 of them, thick leather-bound ledgers with faded gold lettering on the spines. They were not filled with farm accounts or receipts. They were Silas's life's work, his attempt to document the secret life of Oakley County. He had a binder for everything. Soil and water contained hand-drawn maps of underground streams and decades of soil composition tests he'd sent away for. Timber and growth tracked the age and health of the old-growth forests on a dozen different properties. Deeds and titles was filled with photocopies of courthouse records going back to the late 1800s, annotated with Silas's notes on boundary disputes and forgotten right-of-ways. To most, it would have seemed the obsessive hobby of a lonely man. But to Silas, it was a moral imperative. "People forget," he told Elias one evening, tapping a thick binder labeled Mineral and Subsurface. "They get busy, they die, they sell out. The paper they sign gets filed away in a dusty room, and a new map gets drawn that tells a simpler, easier story. But the land doesn't forget. And the old paper, the first paper, it doesn't forget either. The truth is always there. You just have to be willing to go all the way to the bottom to find it." That was his mantra. Go all the way to the bottom. It applied to everything. When a carburetor failed, you didn't just clean it. You disassembled it down to the last jet and needle, laid the pieces out on a clean cloth, and understood the function of each one before reassembling. When a fence line was disputed, you didn't just trust the latest survey. You went to the courthouse and pulled the original deed from 1910, the one that measured from the large oak tree and the stone marker, and you walked the land until you found the rotted stump and the moss-covered stone. Elias absorbed it all. He spent his youth in that barn, his hands graduating from sweeping floors to rebuilding transmissions. His mind, guided by Silas, learned to see the world not as a series of disconnected objects, but as a web of cause and effect. He learned to read the land, to notice how the trees grew differently on one side of a hill, suggesting a change in the soil, to see how a dry creek bed still held the memory of water in the shape of its stones. The Bracken Tract was one of Silas's great obsessions. It was a puzzle he could not solve. He had first come across it while researching old mining claims in the county. "It makes no sense," he'd muttered, spreading a large, brittle map across the workbench. The map was from 1947, a geological survey commissioned by a company called North Ridge Mining. "Look here," he said, his thick finger tracing a dotted line. "This is a registered easement, a 60-foot right-of-way. It cuts clear across the old Hemlock Farm, straight from the state road to the edge of the Bracken land." "But everyone says it's landlocked," young Elias had said. "Everyone is looking at the new maps," Silas grunted. "The ones drawn up after the Hemlock Farm was subdivided in the 70s. This easement was never transferred to the new plat maps. The lawyers for the developer probably didn't even look for it. Why would they? The mining company that owned it went bust in the 50s. The easement was for mineral extraction access. With the mining company gone, they figured the easement was dead." Silas pulled out his Mineral and Subsurface binder. It was filled with old leases, corporate filings, and pages of dense legal text he had painstakingly copied by hand at the state law library. He flipped through the yellowed pages until he found what he was looking for. It was a copy of a lease agreement between the Bracken family and North Ridge Mining, dated 1947. Tucked inside it was a separate document, a single typed page titled Declaration of Easement of Necessity. This was the physical proof, the weapon waiting in the background. It was the original filed instrument creating the right-of-way. Silas had found it misfiled in the county records under N for North Ridge, not B for Bracken or H for Hemlock. It was a clerical error that had rendered it invisible for 50 years. "But here's the kicker," Silas had continued, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. "I spent a week reading state mining laws from that era. When a mining lease is abandoned and the company dissolves, the mineral rights don't just vanish. If the original severance agreement didn't specify otherwise, the rights revert back to the owner of the surface estate. Whoever owns the topsoil on the Bracken Tract also owns whatever is underneath it. And that old easement? It's tied to the land, not the company. It's an easement of necessity. As long as the land needs access for the purpose it was granted, that easement is alive. Its sleeping is all." The puzzle was almost complete, but one piece was missing. Why had North Ridge Mining wanted the land in the first place? The 1947 survey was inconclusive. It mentioned pegmatite deposits and unusual spodumene concentrations, terms that meant little at the time. The company had drilled a few test bores and then abandoned the project, folding a few years later. The search became Silas's quiet passion. He and Elias would spend weekends walking the perimeter of the Bracken Tract, a journey that required crossing 3 different properties and navigating thick, unforgiving brush. They never set foot on the land itself. That would be trespassing, but they studied it from its edges, taking soil samples and looking at the rock outcroppings. Then came the foundational trauma, the event that turned the intellectual exercise into a sacred duty. It was a crisp autumn day. Silas was working under an old combine, trying to free a seized bearing. The jack, old and rusted, gave way. Elias, then just 17, found him an hour later. The weight of the machine had been instantaneous. There was no pain, the doctor said, just a sudden final silence. The world tilted on its axis. The barn, once a place of light and learning, became a tomb filled with the ghost of Silas's voice. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on Elias, threatening to crush him. For months he couldn't bring himself to even open the barn doors. The town saw a quiet, grieving boy. They didn't see the crushing weight of a legacy he felt unequipped to carry. The responsibility was what saved him. One of Silas's customers, an old widow, called in a panic. Her water pump had failed. Elias, moving like a sleepwalker, went to the barn, found Silas's notes on that specific model, and fixed it. The act of working, of using the knowledge Silas had given him, was the only thing that eased the ache. He reopened the shop. He didn't just fix engines, he preserved a philosophy. He became the keeper of the binders. One night, a year after Silas's death, Elias was sitting at the old workbench, turning the pages of the mineral and subsurface binder. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just seeking the comfort of his mentor's handwriting. He came across the Northridge mining file. Tucked into the back, almost as an afterthought, was a thin stapled pamphlet. It wasn't a legal document, it was a technical bulletin from the U.S. Geological Survey, dated 1951. Strategic mineral resources in the Appalachian foothills. Elias almost passed it by, but Silas had taught him to go all the way to the bottom. He opened it. The pamphlet was a dry academic survey of potential resources for national defense. On page 12, there was a small section on lithium. At the time, lithium was a niche element used in small quantities for manufacturing grease and ceramics. The report noted that new research into thermonuclear applications might one day increase demand. It mentioned a few regions of interest, and then a single sentence that made the air in the barn stand still. Preliminary surveys, including those by the now-defunct Northridge Mining Company in Oakley County, indicate potentially significant spodumene deposits, a primary ore of lithium. That was it. That was the missing piece. Northridge wasn't looking for gold or iron. They were on a speculative hunt for a mineral whose true value wouldn't be understood for another 50 years, until the dawn of the age of lithium-ion batteries. The knowledge settled into Elias not with a bang, but with a slow, heavy certainty. The Bracken Tract wasn't dead land. It was a treasure chest, and Silas had left him the map and the key. The land had been forgotten because its value was in the future, a future Silas had glimpsed but never reached. The unpaid tax bill from 1958 was a clerical oversight, a loose thread in the fabric of the county's memory. The last registered owner had died without heirs, and the land had slipped into a legal limbo, too worthless on the surface for anyone to bother with the legal costs of claiming it. Elias closed the binder. He didn't rush to the courthouse. He didn't tell a soul. Silas had taught him patience above all else. The knowledge was safe. It would wait. He had a life to live, a business to run, a promise to keep. He would be a good mechanic. He would honor the man who had taught him to read the story written in oil and stone. And he would wait for the day when the Bracken Tract would finally call out for someone who knew its true name. That day had arrived, on a cold Tuesday morning in a courthouse basement, with the condescending smile of Marcus Sterling hanging in the air. The auctioneer, a portly man named Bill Hastings, whose enthusiasm rose and fell with the value of the property on the block, finally cleared his throat. He shuffled his papers and announced Lot 34. All right, folks. Next up is the Bracken Tract. 320 acres, as is. We all know the story on this one. No access. Been on the books since before I was born. We're here to clear a tax lien from 1958 in the amount of $86.42. Do I have an opening bid at $86.42? His voice was flat, devoid of hope. He expected silence. He expected to pass the lot and move on. The room was quiet, but it was the quiet of people waiting for a punchline. Marcus Sterling leaned back in his chair, a look of theatrical boredom on his face. From the side of the room, a voice, quiet but firm, cut through the stillness. $86.42. Every head turned. It was Elias Thorne. He stood by the wall, his satchel at his feet, his posture unchanged. He hadn't shouted. He had simply stated the fact of his bid. A wave of disbelief, followed by a ripple of stifled laughter, washed through the room. Bill Hastings blinked, genuinely surprised. I have a bid of $86.42 from Mr. Thorne. Do I hear 90? Silence. The developers exchanged amused glances. Peterson, the lean specialist, shook his head as if witnessing a fool part with his money, however small the amount. Marcus Sterling didn't even grant the bid the dignity of a look. He was examining his manicured fingernails, projecting an aura of complete detachment. To him, this was a minor, pathetic diversion. $86.42 is the bid, Hastings repeated, his gaze sweeping the room one last time. Selling for $86.42, going once, going twice. He paused, letting the moment hang, a final chance for sanity to prevail. The only sound was the incessant hum of the fluorescent lights. Sold! The crack of the gavel was sharp and final. For $86.42 to Elias Thorne. A clerk at a folding table, a young woman with tired eyes, looked up and gestured for Elias to come forward. As he walked to the table, the whispers followed him. What's he going to do with it? Poor old fool. Sterling was right chasing ghosts. Elias ignored them. He reached the table, and from his satchel he produced not a wallet, but a small metal cash box, the kind used at bake sales and flea markets. He unlatched it. Inside, nestled in neat stacks, were worn bills and rolls of coins. He carefully counted out $86, and then, from a small compartment, produced 42 cents in dimes, nickels, and pennies. He pushed the exact amount across the table. The clerk stared at the pile of change for a moment before mechanically sweeping it into her drawer. She filled out a temporary deed receipt, her pen scratching against the cheap paper. You'll get the official deed in the mail in 6 to 8 weeks once it's recorded, she said, her voice monotone. Sign here. Elias took the pen. His hand, though calloused and scarred, was perfectly steady. He signed his name with the slow, deliberate script of a man who did not take the act of signing lightly. He took his copy of the receipt, folded it once, and tucked it into the front pocket of his flannel shirt. As he turned to leave, his path was blocked. Marcus Sterling stood before him, his arms crossed. The condescending smile was back, wider this time, tinged with something that looked almost like pity. All right, old man, you had your fun, Sterling said, his voice low and conspiratorial, as if sharing a secret. You made your point, whatever it was. Tell you what, I admire your spirit. I'll give you $1,000 for it, right here, right now. He made a show of reaching into his suit jacket. A quick profit for you. It'll save you the trouble of figuring out you just bought the biggest, most useless paperweight in Oakley County. This was the moment. The first test. Sterling wasn't offering $1,000 because he saw value in the land. He was offering it to assert his dominance, to turn Elias's small, defiant act into a transaction he could control. He was buying back the narrative, reestablishing the natural order of things where men like him decided what it worth, and men like Elias took the scraps they were offered. Elias looked at Sterling's outstretched hand, then back up at his face. The pale blue eyes were calm, unwavering. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply held Sterling's gaze. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable for Sterling, who was used to immediate compliance. No, thank you, Mr. Sterling, Elias said at last. His voice was quiet, respectful, but held a note of finality as solid as a bedrock. I think I'll hold on to it. Sterling's smile faltered. He blinked. It was not the response he had anticipated. He had expected gratitude, or at least a negotiation. This simple, polite refusal was incomprehensible. It didn't fit the script. "You'll hold on to it?" Sterling repeated, a note of incredulous anger creeping into his voice. "It's a rock pile, Elias. It's landlocked. What in God's name do you think you're going to do with it?" Elias didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. He simply gave that same slow nod he had given earlier. "You have a good day now," he said, and made to step around the developer. Infuriated by the dismissal, Sterling grabbed his arm. "Listen to me, you stubborn old fool," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are making a mistake. I am building an empire around that worthless patch of dirt. Don't get in my way." Elias stopped. He looked down at Sterling's hand on his arm, at the fine wool of the suit and the perfectly clean fingers grasping his frayed flannel sleeve. He didn't pull away. He just looked. After a moment, Sterling, unnerved by the quiet, passive resistance, let go as if he'd touched something hot. "Suit yourself," Sterling spat, recovering his composure. He straightened his jacket, a gesture of smoothing his ruffled pride. He turned to the room, which had been watching the exchange with rapt attention, and announced with a theatrical sigh, "Some people you just can't help. He wants to own a piece of the void. Let him." He looked back at Elias one last time, his eyes cold with contempt. Let the dead land lie. With that, he turned and swept out of the room, his entourage of lesser developers scurrying in his wake. Elias stood alone for a moment in the sudden quiet. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the folded corner of the deed receipt, a small, tangible confirmation of a promise made to a ghost in a dusty barn. He had won the first skirmish. He had acquired the board. Now, the long, slow game of chess could truly begin. He pulled his satchel onto his shoulder and walked out of the courthouse basement, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the bright, indifferent light of the day. He had a piece of land to visit. The years that followed were a study in contrasts, a silent war waged between two opposing philosophies. Marcus Sterling's empire rose like a testament to speed and scale. His progress was visible, loud, and relentlessly publicized. Earth-moving equipment, yellow and immense, crawled over the hills surrounding the Bracken Tract, reshaping the landscape. Billboards sprang up along the state road, showcasing elegant houses and smiling families under the banner of Sterling Estates, the future of country living. Sterling was a whirlwind of activity, hosting groundbreakings, schmoozing county officials, and appearing in the local paper, always with his polished shoes and his confident smile. His development was a marvel of modern efficiency. The land was cleared, the lots were graded, and the houses went up in a symphony of nail guns and contractors' trucks. He was building a world of smooth asphalt, manicured lawns, and restrictive covenants. And at the very heart of it, a glaring, infuriating omission, lay the 320 acres of the Bracken Tract, a ragged, untamed hole in his perfect tapestry. It became a personal obsession for him. He saw it as a direct challenge to his authority, a monument to the old man's irrational stubbornness. He began a subtle campaign to isolate Elias. At town meetings, he'd refer casually to the unproductive parcel holding back the county's tax base. He instructed his real estate agents to whisper to potential buyers about the eccentric old recluse next door. The narrative he spun was consistent. Elias Thorne was a problem, a relic standing in the way of progress. He even went so far as to quietly buy the mortgage note on Elias's small house and barn from the regional bank, holding it through a shell corporation. It was a trump card, a piece of leverage he could play if the old man ever faltered. He was certain it was only a matter of time. Elias, meanwhile, seemed to do nothing at all. His life continued its quiet, rhythmic pace, governed by the seasons and the needs of his customers. His victory at the auction had not changed him. He did not boast. He did not flaunt his new ownership. To the outside world, he was the same man, fixing the same old machines in the same old barn. But his work now had a dual purpose. By day, he was a mechanic. By night, he was a scholar, a detective, a guardian of Silas's legacy. The barn became his command center. He spread the old maps and documents across the massive workbench where he and Silas had once laid out engine parts. He used the small profits from his repair work to fund his research. He bought historical satellite images of the county, tracing the ghost of the old 1947 easement. He spent hours at the county records office, not in the bright modern front office, but in the musty basement archive where the old hand-bound ledger books were stored. The clerks, who knew him from his years of quiet research with Silas, would grant him access, watching with bemused affection as the old man spent entire afternoons poring over faded ink and brittle paper. He wasn't filing anything. He was reading. He was cross-referencing. He was going all the way to the bottom. He confirmed every link in the chain of knowledge: the dissolution of Northridge Mining, the specific wording of the state law on reverted mineral rights, the unbroken chain of title on the easement, despite its omission from modern maps. He was building a fortress of facts, a case so airtight that not even a team of high-priced lawyers could breach it. During this time, he faced his own crucible. The long game is not without its moments of doubt. A particularly harsh winter had brought a wave of difficult repairs. Overwhelmed and tired, Elias rushed a job on a John Deere 4020 for a farmer named Henderson, a man whose family had relied on Silas and then Elias for 50 years. 2 weeks later, the tractor's transmission seized in the middle of planting, a catastrophic failure. Word travels fast in a small community. The whispers started immediately. Elias is losing his touch. He's too old for this work. Sterling's right, he's a relic. It was a direct attack on his competence, the very foundation of his identity. Elias felt the sting of it more sharply than any of Sterling's public insults. He had failed the work. He had failed the Henderson family. He had failed Silas. He could have made excuses. He could have blamed the age of the machine or a faulty part. Instead, he drove his old pickup truck out to the Henderson farm. He found the farmer standing by the dead tractor, his face a mask of worry and disappointment. "It's my fault, John," Elias said, his voice raw with shame. "I rushed. I missed a hairline crack in the planetary gear. There's no excuse." He then did something unheard of. He pulled out his checkbook and wrote Henderson a check for the full amount of the original repair, plus an extra $500 for the lost planning time. "This is for the trouble I caused," he said. "Now, if you'll let me, I'm going to haul this back to my shop and make it right. No charge." For the next 3 days and nights, Elias did not sleep. He lived in the barn, fueled by black coffee from his thermos. He tore the transmission down to its hundreds of constituent parts, laying them out in perfect order on clean cloths, just as Silas had taught him. He found the cracked gear, but he didn't just replace it. He rebuilt the entire assembly, machining 2 other worn parts by hand on his ancient metal lathe. He tested every seal, every bearing. When he was finished, the transmission was not just repaired, it was better than new. He delivered the tractor back to Henderson on the 4th day. He didn't say a word, just helped him hitch it to the planter. Henderson climbed into the seat, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He put it in gear, and it moved with a smoothness it hadn't had in years. Henderson idled the tractor down and looked at Elias, his eyes full of a new respect. He tried to give the check back, but Elias refused. "A mistake has to be paid for," Elias said simply. "It's the only way to make sure you don't make it again." The incident, which could have ruined his reputation, ended up cementing it. The story of his public apology and his tireless work to make it right spread through the farming community. It was a quiet counter-narrative to Sterling's campaign of progress and profit. It spoke of an older code, of integrity and accountability. Elias Thorne might be old, but his word and his work were forged from iron. He lost a few fair-weather customers, but he gained the unwavering loyalty of the people who mattered, the ones who understood that true value wasn't measured in speed but in substance. The experience hardened him, sharpening his focus. He had been reminded of what was at stake. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about a way of life. It was about proving that the slow, methodical, honest way of Silas Blackwood was not obsolete. With his reputation secured and his research complete, Elias finally began to set the trap. It was year 5 of Sterling's development. The first phases were sold out, and Sterling was getting ready to break ground on the final, most luxurious section, the one that bordered the Bracken Tract on 3 sides. Elias's first move was subtle. He hired a geological survey company, not a local outfit, but a highly respected firm from 3 states away. He paid them with a cashier's check, leaving no personal trail. Their instructions were specific. Conduct a full subsurface survey of Lot 34, focusing on spodumene deposits, and produce a certified report. His second move was to hire a surveyor, again from out of state. This one was a specialist in historical easements. For 2 days, a quiet professional man in a reflective vest was seen walking the perimeter of what would become Sterling Estates Phase 4, taking measurements with advanced GPS equipment. He was discreet, but not invisible. A few of Sterling's foremen noticed him, but they assumed he was with the county or a utility company. They didn't think to ask. The surveyor located the exact legally described path of the 1947 easement from the state road to the edge of the Bracken tract and marked its corners with small, almost hidden iron pins. His final move was the most critical. He took the certified survey, the geological report, and a copy of the original 1947 easement document to a lawyer in the state capital, a man who specialized in complex property and mineral rights law. Together, they drafted a quiet title action, a legal filing designed to remove any and all competing claims or clouds on a title. They also filed a declaration of easement, formally reasserting the 1947 right-of-way and placing it back onto the public record. Crucially, they filed it in a way that was legally sound, but strategically obscure. The legal notices were published not in the Oakley County Chronicle, but in a small, little red legal journal that served the entire state, fulfilling the letter of the law for public notification. Marcus Sterling, with his team of high-priced corporate lawyers, was busy navigating zoning variations and construction permits. They were looking forward, not backward. The notice in a dusty legal journal about an old parcel of scrubland was a whisper in a hurricane. They missed it completely. The trap was now set. The legal filings were a time bomb, ticking away in a public records office. Elias had reestablished his ownership of the mineral rights and the legal existence of the easement. Sterling was now pouring millions of dollars into developing a luxury community around a piece of land that he believed was a worthless, inaccessible hole. But Elias knew the truth. It wasn't a hole. It was a gateway. And soon, he would open it. He watched the construction trucks roll by his barn, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a small, grim smile. The land was no longer dead. It was just waiting for the wake-up call. The call came in the form of a cream-colored invitation, thick as cardstock, delivered to every mailbox in Oakley County. It announced the Sterling Estates Community Progress Gala, an event to celebrate the completion of Phase 3 and the groundbreaking of the final premier section, the pinnacle at Sterling Estates. There would be a barbecue, a live band, and a special address by Marcus Sterling himself. It was to be his victory lap, a public coronation. The event was held on a sprawling, freshly sodded lawn that a year ago had been a wildflower meadow. A massive white tent shimmered in the late afternoon sun. The air was filled with the smell of roasting pork and the sound of cheerful, oblivious chatter. Half the county was there, families drawn by the free food, local business owners eager to curry favor with Sterling, and the county commissioners beaming as if the success were their own. Elias arrived alone, wearing the same flannel shirt and work boots. He parked his old pickup truck at the far end of the lot, next to a gleaming row of German sedans and luxury SUVs. As he walked toward the tent, he was an island of analog reality in a digital sea of prosperity. He drew a few stares, a few pointed whispers. He was the ghost at the feast, the one person who didn't fit the gleaming picture of progress. He didn't get a plate of food. He moved to the edge of the crowd, near the back of the tent, and waited, his thermos of coffee in hand. He watched as Sterling moved through the crowd, shaking hands, clapping backs, his smile a beacon of manufactured warmth. He was the king in his court, and this was his day. Finally, Sterling climbed onto a small, elevated stage at the front of the tent. A giant artist's rendering of the completed Sterling Estates was mounted behind him. It showed curving streets, stately homes, a golf course, and a clubhouse. And right in the middle, a conspicuous blank space labeled Future County Parkland, pending acquisition. "Friends, neighbors," Sterling began, his voice amplified by a microphone, smooth and confident. "Welcome. Look around you. This is what progress looks like. This is the future of Oakley County." He spoke for 10 minutes, a symphony of buzzwords: community, investment, quality of life, shared vision. He thanked the commissioners, the contractors, the banks. He was building to a crescendo, a moment of staged magnanimity he had rehearsed a dozen times. "But our work isn't quite done," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious, intimate tone. He gestured to the blank space on the map behind him. "That hole in the middle of our beautiful community. The Bracken Tract. For 5 years it has sat there, a reminder of the past, holding us back from our full potential." He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing, as if by chance, on Elias. He beckoned him forward. "Mr. Elias Thorne is here with us today. Come on up, Elias, don't be shy." A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to the old man at the back. Reluctantly, slowly, Elias began to walk forward, the crowd parting before him. He stopped at the foot of the stage, his pale blue eyes looking up at the man in the expensive suit. "Elias," Sterling said, his voice dripping with false generosity, "I believe in this community, and I believe that no one person should stand in the way of progress for all. So I want to make you a final public offer, not as a developer, but as a neighbor." He paused for dramatic effect. $10,000, he announced, "for your 320 acres. I know it's just scrubland. I know it's worthless to you. But I will personally donate it to the county to be preserved as a park. It's more than a fair price for land you can't even get to. It's a chance for you to be a part of this community's future, not its past." The crowd applauded. It was a masterful piece of theater. He had painted Elias into a corner. If he refused, he was a greedy, stubborn old man holding up a public park. If he accepted, he was admitting defeat, validating Sterling's narrative that the land and the man were worthless. Sterling wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded check and a deed transfer document. This was the final aggressive move, the public execution. "Sign the deed, Elias," he said, his voice ringing with triumph. "Right here, right now. Let's put the past behind us. Be a hero for the community." He held out the pen. The entire tent was silent, watching, waiting for the old man to bow to the inevitable. Elias looked at the pen, then at the deed. He didn't take them. Instead, from the inside pocket of his own worn jacket, he produced a single folded, yellowed piece of paper. He held it up. It was a copy of the 1947 Easement of Necessity. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, a new voice cut through the silence. It was clear, authoritative, and unamplified. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Sterling." A man was walking toward the stage from the side of the tent. He wore a simple, functional suit and carried a briefcase. He was unremarkable in every way, which in this context made him stand out more than anyone. He was not part of the show. "My name is David Chen," the man said, his voice calm and professional. "I'm with the State Department of Mines, Minerals, and Land Reclamation." Sterling stared at him, his triumphant smile frozen in place. "I'm sorry," he said. "This is a private event." "I'm here on official business," Chen replied, ignoring the dismissal. He turned to address the silent, confused crowd. "At the request of the landowner, Mr. Elias Thorne, my department, in conjunction with an independent geological firm, has completed a review of the property known as Lot 34, the Bracken Tract." He paused, letting his words sink in. He looked directly at Sterling, his expression neutral, his voice flat. He delivered the single sentence that changed everything. "Our certified assessment confirms that the tract contains one of the most significant deposits of high-grade lithium spodumene in the state, with an estimated market value of between $90 and $120 million. Silence. It was not a normal silence. It was a vacuum. The sound of the world seemed to stop. The breeze in the tent flaps ceased. The distant hum of a generator vanished. In that moment of absolute stillness, 100 different calculations were being made in 100 different minds. The word lithium, the number 100 million, the name Elias Thorne. The concepts rearranged themselves, snapping into a new, terrifying, and brilliant configuration. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of confident charisma, seemed to melt. The color drained from it, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. The check in his hand, which moments before had been a symbol of his power, now looked like a child's toy. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Chen was not finished. He turned his attention back to Sterling. Furthermore, he continued, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a diamond blade, a quiet title action filed by Mr. Thorne and ratified by the state court 3 months ago has affirmed his unencumbered ownership of both the surface and all subsurface mineral rights. The court also affirmed the legal validity of a 60-foot wide easement of necessity filed in 1947, which grants Mr. Thorne's holdings access for the purposes of mineral extraction. That easement, according to the official survey, runs directly from the state road through the center of your planned Pinnacle development. The second hammer blow. If the first had stunned them, this one crippled them. A 60-foot wide road, not for a family car, but for mining trucks, dump trucks, heavy equipment, 24 hours a day, through the heart of his luxury paradise. The silence finally broke. It was replaced by a collective indrawn breath, a gasp that swept through the crowd like a wave. People turned to look at each other, their faces a mixture of awe, shock, and dawning comprehension. They looked at the giant map behind Sterling, at the pristine lawns and elegant houses, and they pictured a massive, dusty, noisy mining road cutting it in two. The Sterling estate's dream evaporated in an instant. It was in this moment of profound, echoing silence, with Sterling standing on the stage like a statue of his own ruin, that Elias Thorne finally spoke. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. He looked at the shattered man before him, then out at the faces of his neighbors, the people who had watched him, judged him, and dismissed him for years. He held up the yellowed copy of the easement, the paper Silas had found so long ago. "My mentor, Silas Blackwood, taught me something," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "He said people forget. They get busy. They draw new maps. But the land doesn't forget. And the old paper always remembers the truth." He then looked directly at Marcus Sterling, whose empire was crumbling before his eyes. Elias's expression was not one of triumph or glee. It was one of deep, weary finality. He gave Sterling the same slow, considered nod he had given him 5 years earlier in the courthouse basement. "Some things," Elias said, his voice a quiet echo of the insult that had started it all, "are not meant to be left to lie." He didn't need to say another word. The verdict was rendered not by him, but by the crowd. It began with one family, then another, quietly turning and walking away from the tent, away from the smell of roasted pork and the wreckage of Sterling's ambition. They walked past the gleaming cars, past the billboards promising a future that would never arrive. They were voting with their feet. They were leaving the man who sold them a polished lie and walking back into the world of the quiet old man who had held on to a dusty truth. Within minutes, the tent was half empty. Sterling stood alone on the stage, the microphone still live, broadcasting the sound of his ragged, shallow breathing into the suddenly vast and empty space. The gala was over. The empire was dead. The collapse of Sterling Estates was as swift as its rise had been spectacular. The news of the lithium deposit and the mining easement spread through the financial world like a wildfire. Sterling's investors, who had gambled on luxury real estate, had no interest in being neighbors to a massive mining operation. They pulled their funding overnight. The banks called in his loans. Construction on Phase 4 halted immediately, the half-finished frames of houses left to stand like skeletons against the sky. Sterling, a man whose entire existence was built on leverage and the perception of success, found himself with neither. He was ruined. He tried to fight, of course. His lawyers filed a flurry of lawsuits against Elias, against the county, against the state. They claimed the easement was invalid, that the quiet title action was fraudulent, but it was a desperate, futile gesture. Elias's case, built over years of patient, meticulous research, was a fortress. The paper trail was perfect. Silas had taught him to go all the way to the bottom, and the foundation he had laid was unshakable. Every suit was dismissed, each one costing Sterling more money he no longer had. The bankruptcy auction of Sterling's assets was a somber affair, held in the same courthouse basement where it had all begun. The Vance brothers and other local predators circled, picking over the bones of his fallen empire. Elias was there, but he did not bid on the construction equipment or the parcels of land. He waited. He waited until the auctioneer announced a bundle of miscellaneous financial assets, including a portfolio of small private mortgage notes acquired by Sterling's Shell Corporation. When the note for his own small house and barn came up, Elias made his only bid. He bought his own freedom, quietly and without fanfare, for pennies on the dollar. It was not an act of aggression, but of closure. A final, quiet act of securing the foundation from which his victory had been launched. This was his small, compassionate detail, an act of self-preservation that also denied any other predator the chance to hold a weapon over him. He was ensuring his own peace, not gloating over another's ruin. Marcus Sterling disappeared from Oakley County. His name was scraped off the billboards. The half-built houses were eventually torn down. The land, scarred by his ambition, slowly began to heal. He was last seen by Elias months later at a gas station 2 counties over. Sterling was driving a dusty, decade-old sedan, his expensive suit replaced by a cheap polo shirt. He looked tired and diminished. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the pumps. Elias saw not an enemy, but just a man, stripped of his illusions. He gave a simple, final nod, an acknowledgement of the end of the story, and Sterling quickly looked away, got in his car, and drove off, vanishing for good. Elias Thorne did not become a mining tycoon. That was never the point. Silas's lessons were not about the accumulation of wealth, but about the stewardship of value. He did not sell the land. He leased the mineral rights to a responsible, forward-thinking extraction company, one that agreed to his strict, non-negotiable terms for environmental protection and land reclamation. The contract itself was a tribute to Silas, filled with clauses about water table monitoring, soil preservation, and native plant reseeding. The money, when it came, was staggering, a flood of wealth that would have drowned a lesser man. But Elias's life had been forged in sufficiency, not excess. He did not change. He still lived in the same small house, still drove the same old pickup truck, still wore the same flannel shirts. He used the wealth as a tool, just as he would a wrench or a lathe. He established the Silas Blackwood Foundation, a permanent endowment dedicated to funding education in the practical arts. It provided scholarships for young people in Oakley County to become mechanics, surveyors, electricians, geologists, and welders, the very trades that built and maintained the tangible world. He bought the old Henderson farm when John retired, not to develop it, but to turn it into a teaching farm, preserving heritage breeds and sustainable methods. And he restored the barn. He cleaned and oiled every tool, organized every can of bolts, and placed the leather-bound binders back on their shelf, not as relics, but as living textbooks. One crisp autumn afternoon, a few years after the Sterling affair had faded into local legend, a dusty hatchback pulled up to the barn. A young woman got out. She was maybe 19, lanky and earnest, with a notebook clutched in her hand and a nervous energy about her. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "That's me," Elias said, wiping his hands on a rag. "My name is Sarah. My family owns a small farm over on the West Ridge," she began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been looking at our deed. It's really old. It mentions a water right from a spring that isn't on our property anymore. The county map says the spring is on the land next door, which just got sold. Everyone says the right is gone. But I found this." She opened her notebook to a page with a hand-drawn map and a series of questions. "I read about what you did. I was hoping you could tell me how to find the old paper." Elias looked at her. He saw the same hunger, the same refusal to accept the simple, easy story that he had seen in his own reflection as a boy. He saw the future, A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a smile of deep and profound satisfaction. The circle was completing. The knowledge was not his to own. It was his to pass on. He gestured toward the open barn doors, toward the low, cathedral-like light and the smell of oil and old wood. "Come on in," he said. "Let's start at the beginning." He walked over to the shelf and took down a thick, dusty binder. Deeds and titles. He blew a fine layer of dust from the cover and laid it on the clean, open space of the workbench. He opened it to the first page, to the faded ink and the blocky, honest handwriting of Silas Blackwood. Sterling built his world on what things cost, a world of polished surfaces and quick transactions. Elias Thorne built his on what things were worth, a world of substance, patience, and integrity. In the end, the county, the community, the very land itself, which knows nothing of price, always pays its debts. It pays them not to the loudest voice or the fullest pocket, but to the quiet hands that took the time to read the deed, to honor the past, and to listen to the stories the earth remembers. The most valuable things are never for sale, but are passed from one pair of hands to the next in the sacred trust of a promise kept. The land remembers the ones who keep reading.